I can't provide a verbatim imitation of Chase Hughes's exact style, but I can create an original, long-form script that captures some high-level characteristics associated with that type of content. Behavioral analysis, psychological observation, direct delivery, and persuasive storytelling. Most people misunderstand what happens when a deeply empathetic person heals. They think healing makes a person softer, more available, more forgiving, more understanding. In reality, the opposite often happens. Not because healing turns them cold, not because healing removes compassion, but because healing removes confusion. And confusion was the thing that used to keep them accessible. Think about that for a moment. A broken empath is often available to everyone. The healed empath is available to very few. That sounds backwards until you understand the psychology behind it. When most people imagine empathy, they imagine kindness. They imagine patience. They imagine sacrifice. They imagine someone who always understands. Someone who always gives another chance. Someone who always sees the good in people. But what they fail to recognize is that many empaths learned empathy through pain. Not wisdom. Pain. They became experts at reading emotions because they had to. They learned how to monitor moods because their environment demanded it. They learned how to predict reactions because unpredictability felt dangerous. They learned how to absorb other people's feelings because survival required awareness. What looked like compassion was often adaptation. What looked like emotional intelligence was sometimes hypervigilance. What looked like unconditional love was occasionally fear disguised as loyalty. The broken empath spends years believing their greatest strength is their ability to understand everyone. The healed empath eventually discovers that understanding everyone is not the same thing as giving everyone access. That realization changes everything. When people first meet a broken empath, they often feel incredibly seen. The empath notices details, subtle emotional shifts, tiny changes in energy, micro-expressions, patterns in language, behavioral inconsistencies. The empath notices things others ignore. This creates a powerful experience. People feel understood, connected, valued, important. But there is a hidden cost. The empath is often paying attention to everyone except themselves. Their awareness points outward, never inward. They can explain everyone else's behavior, everyone else's trauma, everyone else's fears, everyone else's motivations. But ask them what they want. Ask them what they need. Ask them what boundaries they require. Suddenly the answers become unclear. That is not empathy. That is self-abandonment wearing empathy's clothing. And eventually the bill comes due. Because every relationship built on self-abandonment carries an expiration date. Sooner or later the empath becomes exhausted. Not from giving without receiving. Not from caring without protection. Not from loving without limits. The strange thing is that most people do not notice the change when healing begins. They only notice it after healing is complete. Because the transformation happens internally, long before it becomes visible externally. At first the empath starts asking questions. Simple questions. Questions they should have asked years ago. Why am I always understanding other people but nobody understands me? Why am I always adjusting but nobody else adjusts? Why am I always forgiving but nobody changes? Why am I carrying relationships that other people barely maintain? Those questions seem harmless. But they are dangerous. Because awareness creates friction, and friction creates change. The moment a person begins questioning dysfunctional patterns, those patterns become harder to maintain. The broken empath used to tolerate behavior automatically. The healing empath starts evaluating it consciously, and evaluation changes everything. People often assume healing is about becoming more loving. Sometimes healing is about becoming more selective. That's the part nobody talks about. The healed empath does not lose compassion. They lose automatic access. There is a difference. A massive difference. The broken empath opens the door first and asks questions later. The healed empath asks questions first and decides whether the door should open at all. From the outside, this can appear cold, especially to people who benefited from the empath's previous lack of boundaries. Those people often experience healing as rejection. But healing is not rejection. It is filtration. The empath stops asking, how can I keep this person? And starts asking, why is this person here? That shift is profound. Because attention determines value. Whatever receives your attention receives your energy. Whatever receives your energy grows. For years, the broken empath poured energy into relationships that offered little return. They invested in potential, possibility, hope, fantasy, future versions of people. The healed empath becomes interested in reality, not potential. Reality, not promises. Behavior, not intentions. Patterns. This is why healed empaths become difficult to manipulate. Manipulation depends on emotional leverage. The manipulator needs access to guilt, fear, obligation, hope, insecurity. The broken empath carried all of those vulnerabilities. The healed empath begins dismantling them one by one. And when those vulnerabilities disappear, manipulation loses effectiveness. This creates a fascinating phenomenon. People who once felt powerful around the empath suddenly feel powerless. Nothing they say works anymore. The guilt trips fail. The emotional pressure fails. The silent treatment fails. The victim narratives fail. The manufactured emergencies fail. The emotional hooks stop connecting. Not because the empath stopped caring, because caring is no longer enough to override discernment. Discernment is what makes healed empaths seem unreachable. Most people think the distance comes from emotional walls. Often it comes from emotional clarity. The healed empath can identify a pattern much faster than before. They no longer require years of evidence. They no longer require repeated betrayals. They no longer require endless explanations. They see the pattern. They trust the pattern. They act accordingly. That speed surprises people. The same empath who once tolerated nonsense for years now walks away in weeks, sometimes days, sometimes minutes. Observers interpret this as harshness. It isn't harshness. It is recognition. The healed empath understands something most people learn too late. Every relationship teaches people how to treat you. Every interaction provides instruction. Every tolerated behavior becomes a precedent. And precedents shape futures. The broken empath was always editing reality, searching for reasons, searching for context, searching for explanations. The healed empath still understands context. They simply refuse to let context erase accountability. That distinction matters a lot. You can understand why someone behaves badly without accepting bad behavior. You can understand trauma without tolerating mistreatment. You can understand pain without becoming responsible for it. This realization creates distance between the healed empath and many people from their past, because entire relationships were built upon the assumption that empathy guaranteed access. The assumption was wrong. Empathy does not guarantee access. Empathy guarantees understanding. Those are completely different things. A healed empath can understand exactly why someone behaves a certain way and still choose not to participate. That choice shocks people, especially people accustomed to endless chances. The broken empath believed understanding required involvement. The healed empath learns understanding can exist alongside separation. This is one reason healed empaths appear unreachable. People approach them using strategies that worked before. The old guilt, the old stories, the old emotional appeals. Nothing happens. The doors remain closed. Not locked, closed. And that's an important distinction. The healed empath is not angry. Anger often keeps people connected. The healed empath is usually calm. Calm is much harder to influence. A person driven by anger can be manipulated through conflict. A person operating from clarity becomes much harder to move. The healed empath no longer needs to win, no longer needs to convince, no longer needs validation, no longer needs understanding from everyone. The need disappears. And with it, a tremendous amount of vulnerability disappears too. Need creates openings. When need fades, those openings shrink. There is another reason healed empaths become unreachable. They stop seeing themselves as responsible for other people's growth. This sounds obvious, but for many empaths it is revolutionary. For years they believed they could help everyone heal, everyone improve, everyone evolve, everyone transform. They carried emotional responsibilities that never belonged to them. They became therapists without credentials, rescuers without requests, caretakers without limits. The problem is that helping can become addictive. Helping creates significance. Helping creates purpose. Helping creates identity. Eventually, the empath becomes trapped inside the role. If someone needs saving, they feel valuable. If someone struggles, they feel necessary. If someone depends on them, they feel important. Healing breaks that cycle. The empath realizes they do not need to be needed. Read that again. They do not need to be needed. That single realization changes relationship dynamics dramatically. Because many unhealthy relationships survive on dependency. Not connection. Dependency. The moment dependency disappears, the true quality of the relationship becomes visible. Some relationships thrive. Others collapse immediately. The healed empath accepts both outcomes. That acceptance creates another layer of distance. People can no longer control them through necessity. Necessity used to be the leash. The leash is gone. Another fascinating shift occurs in communication. The broken empath constantly explains themselves. Constantly. They over-explain decisions, over-explain boundaries, over-explain feelings, over-explain intentions. Why? Because they fear being misunderstood. The healed empath discovers something liberating. Being understood is not always required. Sometimes people misunderstand because misunderstanding benefits them. Sometimes explanations are invitations for negotiation. Sometimes clarity is interpreted as weakness. The healed empath learns that a complete sentence can be remarkably short. No, I disagree. That doesn't work for me. I'm unavailable. Those statements require no novel-length justification. The ability to communicate simply often makes healed empaths seem intimidating. Not because simplicity is aggressive, because certainty is rare. People are accustomed to negotiating, persuading, pressuring, explaining. When certainty appears, negotiation becomes difficult. The healed empath develops certainty, not arrogance. Certainty, those are different things. Arrogance says, I know everything. Certainty says, I know enough. Enough to choose, enough to decide, enough to leave, enough to stay, enough to protect peace. One of the biggest misconceptions about healed empaths is that they stop loving deeply. Nothing could be further from reality. They often love more deeply than ever. The difference is where the love goes. The broken empath spreads love everywhere. The healed empath invests it carefully. As the broken empath measures love by quantity. The healed empath measures love by quality. The broken empath gives everyone a key. The healed empath changes the lock entirely. People who once enjoyed unlimited access experience this as rejection. It isn't rejection. It is qualification. Access now requires reciprocity, consistency, integrity, accountability, respect. The standards increase, not because the empath became superior, because the empath finally recognized their own value. Value changes behavior. Think about how people treat things they consider valuable. They protect them, maintain them, respect them. The healed empath finally applies that principle inward, and that inward shift changes every outward relationship. The most surprising thing is how many people become uncomfortable when the empath heals. You would expect support, celebration, encouragement. Instead, you often see resistance. Why? Because healing changes agreements. Unspoken agreements. Invisible agreements. The broken empath unconsciously agreed to carry emotional weight for others. The healed empath withdraws from the agreement. The people benefiting from the arrangement notice immediately. Suddenly, they have to carry their own responsibilities, their own emotions, their own consequences, their own growth. Not everyone likes that. Some people preferred the old version, the accessible version, the available version, the endlessly understanding version, the version that never left, the version that tolerated everything. The healed empath is not that person anymore. And that can feel threatening. There is another layer few people discuss. The healed empath becomes comfortable with disappointment. That sounds negative. It isn't. It is powerful. Most manipulation works because people fear disappointment. They fear losing connection, fear losing approval, fear losing relationships, fear losing opportunities. The healed empath learns disappointment is survivable. Once disappointment becomes survivable, fear loses influence. And when fear loses influence, freedom expands. The healed empath no longer chases people, no longer convinces people, no longer auditions for acceptance, no longer performs for belonging. Belonging either exists or it doesn't. The healed empath stops manufacturing it. This creates a strange effect. People begin describing them as distant, mysterious, hard to reach. The reality is much simpler. They are no longer standing in places where everyone can reach them. They moved. Psychologically, emotionally, relationally. The address changed. People keep visiting the old location and wondering why nobody answers. The healed empath left years ago. The final transformation is perhaps the most important. The healed empath stops confusing peace with loneliness. For years they tolerated chaos because silence felt uncomfortable. Relationships felt better than solitude. Attention felt better than emptiness. Connection felt better than self-confrontation. Healing changes that equation. Solitude becomes peaceful. Stillness becomes restorative. Silence becomes informative. The healed empath learns to enjoy their own company. And that changes everything. Because people who enjoy their own company become difficult to control. They are not desperate, not starving, not searching, not chasing. They can walk away. They can wait. They can observe. They can choose. Choice is powerful. Choice is freedom. And freedom often looks unreachable to people who are accustomed to access. The healed empath is not unreachable because they built walls. They are unreachable because they stopped abandoning themselves to make everyone else comfortable. They stopped volunteering for emotional labor nobody requested. They stopped mistaking sacrifice for love. They stopped confusing understanding with obligation. They stopped interpreting boundaries as selfishness. They stopped making themselves smaller so other people could remain comfortable. And once that transformation is complete, something remarkable happens. The people who genuinely value them get closer. The people who only use them disappear. The noise fades. The patterns become obvious. The relationships become cleaner. The conversations become honest. The connections become reciprocal. And to anyone who benefited from the old version, the healed empath seems impossible to access, impossible to influence, impossible to pull back into old dynamics, because the person they are trying to reach no longer exists.